Hello everyone and welcome. In this video I will present you this fully automated infinite wood farm. So you don't need to AFK and right click, you don't need to put bone meal in a chest, you don't have to do anything, you just have to turn it on in a loaded chunk and it will produce more than 1000 logs per hour. Everything is fully automated. In addition, if you need more logs, if you already have a bone meal farm, you can also overclock this farm by providing more bone meal. And in this case, it will produce up to 1600 logs per hour. And if you also need some of these items, you can also collect them with this farm. You just need to switch these levers here, and the item will be stored in the chest instead of being composted. In this video, I will present this farm, how it works, and the technical details you need to know. If you're just interested in building this farm and not in how it works, you will find a link to the block-by-block tutorial and to the world download in the description, but I strongly recommend you to watch this video as well to understand how it works. Before we start, make sure to like, share and comment this video, as this is the very first video on this channel. It would help a lot, and of course if you don't want to miss next videos, you can also subscribe to the channel. So how does this farm works? Well, the core concept is quite simple. First, you need to bone meal a Nylium block. It has a small chance to grow a fungus. Once you get a fungus, you can also bone meal it with another dispenser, and it has a small chance to grow into a huge fungus. Now, once you have a tree, you can blow up this tree with TNT, for example, and you will get, of course, logs from the trunk, ward block and shroom light. Now, if you compost the ward blocks and the shroom light, you can get some bone meal. With this bone meal, you can repeat the process. So it's quite simple. By using the bone meal you get from the tree, you can grow a new tree and so on. The trick is that you need to make the farm self-sufficient, so you need to produce more bone meal from the trees than you used to get them in the first place. So before we get into the details of these steps, I just want to present the core of the farm. So this is from a design presented by Tech in one of his Minecraft episode. So I will put a link in the description, of course. So basically we have a dispenser here. Bone milling an Nylium block, it generates some vegetation on top, and we try to bone meal this vegetation with another dispenser. Now, if this is not a fungus, this will do nothing, and after a few trials, we can pull the Nylium block down and up back, and this will break the vegetation, and we can try to get another fungus. So we can try again, and this time, let's say we get a fungus. And when we bone meal it with the second dispenser, it will eventually grow into a tree through the hoppers just above. And for this block here, we have this piston here on the side that will grab the block and push it up, so it can get with the rest of the tree and being blown up by the TNT, and with the block falling into the hoppers to be collected and recomposted for the wart and the shroom light. Now, in his episode, Tech uses this setup with 4 of these modules in this kind of configuration. This works well, but it is far from self-sufficient in bone meal. So now we'll see how to optimize each step of the process in order to make this kind of setup produce more bone meal that it uses to grow the trees. The first step of the process is getting a fungus. So we want to do this with as few bone meal as possible. To do that, we need to look closer on how the bone meal process works. So basically, when you bone meal a Nylium block, not only this block produces some vegetation, but also all Nylium blocks at the same level in a 5x5 area also have a chance to produce fungus or roots or any kind of vegetation. We can use this fact to reduce the number of bone meal we use in the farm. By removing 3 of the 4 dispensers, we can just, with 1 bone meal, potentially grow 4 fungus on all the blocks. But we can do even better by looking at the vegetation growth more precisely. So basically, when you bone meal a block, all the blocks around have a chance to grow some vegetation. But the closer you are from the center block, where the bone meal is applied, the more chance you get of getting something growing. So for example, on the center block, we need on average 12 bone meals to get a fungus, while on the very edge of the platform, so very far from the center, it requires 70 attempts to get a fungus. So if we want to maximize the number of fungus we get per bone meal, we need to get all the Nylium blocks as close as possible from the one in the center receiving the bone meal. Of course, we could use a very narrow platform like that, but in this case, it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to fit all the dispensers and the pistons around, and we would have to place dispensers above the blocks facing down, but this would make the design less flat with the collection area one block higher. Thus, it would reduce the number of logs and ward blocks we get from each tree. So the idea is to use this kind of shape instead. The blocks are not as close as in this previous one, but we have space around the Nylium blocks to build the dispensers and the pistons. The final design we use is this one, with 3 blocks in diagonal of the center block and 1 block a bit further here because of placement constraints. And if we want to keep the setup very flat and the platform at this height just above the dispensers, it is the most compact design we can use. With this design, it takes an average only 3.9 bone meal to get a fungus against 8 bone meal in the original design with the 4 dispensers. So we more than doubled the bone meal efficiency of the farm with by using this setup instead of 4 dispensers and 4 blocks. Now another possible design is this one, with a closer block here directly next to the center one, but it's a bit less efficient, requiring 4.4 bone meal on average to get a fungus, so it's worse than this one. So this one will be the design we keep for the farm. The next step in the process is to transform the fungus into a tree. So every time we bone meal a fungus, there is a 40% chance of getting a tree. This means that getting a tree from a fungus costs on average 2.5 bone meals, and there is nothing we can do about that. There is still a problem of knowing when we successfully got our tree. Adding some redstone around all the Nylium blocks would take some place, and we already are in a tight space around our Nylium blocks. So instead we go for another approach. We perform a fixed number of attempts before the vegetation is broken. This is not ideal, as in this case we could break a fungus before it is actually converted into a tree, so we need to give it enough attempts so we are almost sure it would be converted. Here we can see the probability a fungus is converted to a tree after a certain amount of attempts. If we are above 10 attempts, there is almost no fungus lost, and with an average of 1 wasted fungus in 165, so it's pretty good for our farm. We can now sum up the consumption of the farm, so it will take on average 3.9 bone meal to get a fungus, and then 2.5 more to get a tree. So in total it costs us 6.4 bone meal per tree. The question is now, how many bone meal can we expect to get back from one tree? A huge fungus can grow at most this shape here, with up to 3 blocks in each direction from the trunk. If we assume we can collect all the blocks from all the trees, minus this bottom layer here, because it is below the collection platform, and this layer here, because the place is already taken by the collection hoppers, we get on average 7.4 bone meal per tree, which means that each tree returns exactly 1 more bone meal that used to be grown. However, there is another factor to consider. We also need to add an ancient debris column with pistons to create a drop chute here for the TNT, and all these blocks will prevent wart from growing, reducing the return we get from each tree. So we need to place our 5 Nylium blocks in the configuration that will minimize this loss. So here are different possible configurations. The red concrete represents the maximum blast radius for a TNT, and the glass all the positions where wart can grow. Yellow glass indicates places where we can't collect the wart, either because there is an obstacle or because it is outside of the blast radius. From all the possibilities, this one offers minimal obstruction to the growth of the trees with only these 3 blocks here being occupied, and it fits entirely inside the TNT range. So this is the setup we use for the farm. Evaluating the effect of the obstructed blocks on the rate is a bit difficult because of 2 reasons. First, they don't affect all the trees in the same way. These 2 trees are almost unaffected with only 1 missing growth space, while the trees closer are losing more space. The other reason is that fungus are not uniformly distributed over the 5 Nylium blocks. The center one here has more than 33% of the trees, while the farthest one has only 10%. Basically, all math done for the 5 tree configurations with their respective fungus probabilities, the result is that the obstructing blocks cause a 0.32 bone meal loss per tree on average. This means that in total, this farm could theoretically produce 1.17 bone meal for each bone meal use, or a total net gain of 0.17 bone meal. So now let's see the TNT-based collection part of the farm. So basically we want to blow up every single block where a tree can possibly grow. This means all this area here around each of the trunks. To do so, we have this ancient debris column here that will create a drop chute for the TNT here, so we can blow up the trees from the bottom to the top. This is very important, as if we exploited the trees from the top, blocks would actually land on the bottom part of the trees and be blown up by the next TNT. By starting from the bottom, we can actually collect the bottom blocks before the next TNT explodes. As we want to blow up all the blocks, we use TNT at 8 different levels, and as it is much more likely we get small trees than very big ones, TNTs are more concentrated in the bottom part of the farm. Also, as small trees are much more common than very tall ones, we do not blow all the TNTs every time. Instead, only the 2 at the bottom are used every time, then the frequency is divided by a factor of 2 at each height. So basically, the third one blows every 2 times, the first one every 4 times, and so on. Like so, the last TNT is only used every 64 times. This saves some time for the TNT part of the farm, and while it does not change the bone meal outcome of the farm, it significantly increases the rates per hour by letting it run faster. The height of the lowest TNT has been set very carefully. This is the actual minimal height at which we can explode the TNT. The explosion would be more efficient at a lower height, but it could also damage the collection platform with the hoppers. We could of course protect it by placing some ender chests, like in some other design, but this would remove one potential layer for the ward to grow. The only downside for this TNT to blow a bit higher is that there are 4 blocks for which the blast is not strong enough to explode a ward block. These 2 blocks here and these 2 blocks here. If ward would grow here, some blocks could actually land on top and not be collected by the hoppers. So instead, we place a fence gate here that will prevent the ward from growing in the first place and let the items fall through it and could be collected by the hoppers below. The rest of the collection area is very simple. We just have a hopper platform collecting the falling blocks. It is 2 blocks wider than the size of the tree area to collect items even if they have a bit of momentum when they fall. We also have some waterlogged slabs here that have 2 roles. First, the water shields the hoppers below from the TNT blast. Without it, all these hoppers here could explode with the lowest TNT. The water is also designed so items landing on top of non-hoppers block are flushed on the side and collected by the hoppers instead of staying still on the block. Water also does not prevent the ward from growing, which means that we only lose a potential growing area on where there are slabs. So this means we only lose 3 blocks here on this side and 3 blocks here on this side. It does not significantly hurt the rates of the farm. These blocks here are out of sight of the TNT and thus they can't be blown up. Because we still want to get them, we have 1 column of pistons here on each side that will push the blocks inside the TNT blast. If 2 trees would grow at the exact same height, or if there are some leftovers from a previous tree, some blocks could be pushed out of the blast radius here on the side. This is a very rare event. I run this farm for many days and it happened only a few times. But in case this happens, that would mean that some blocks here would be floating here. They don't really hurt the farm because they are quite far from the growing area of the tree, but I designed the whole TNT setup specifically not to have any floating blocks, so instead we have here this nice obsidian wall to prevent that from happening at all. This setup is not perfect though, and we still have some loss, especially when bottom blocks are not blown up. In this case, items can fall on the top and are destroyed by the next TNT. This does not happen very often, but it is still hurting the rate of the farm, and we actually only collect around 93% of all the blocks from the trees. We need to update our benefits numbers. So with the loss, we actually only have 0.18 bone meal benefit per tree, or 1.05 bone meal collected per bone meal used, which is very close to not being self-sufficient. And actually, there is another fact we need to consider. When two trees grow next to each other, some of the blocks of one tree will not be generated, which means that it reduces the amount of wart we collect and thus the number of bone meal we get. This is difficult to measure, but it can't be neglected. Because of that, the ratio of the farm is not 1.05 anymore, but somewhere just below 1. This means that the farm is not self-sufficient anymore, and we need another bone meal source if we want to run the farm correctly. We are now inside the farm, just below the collection hoppers, and inside the Nylium blocks here, there are some hopper minecarts. They collect the broken vegetation, like roots or non-grown fungus, for example, and these vegetation are then collected by hoppers and sent back to the main collection system through hoppers to be composted with the wart block and the shroom lights. This provides an additional 0.17 bone meal, so meaning that the farm now produces more than enough bone meal to run forever, even with the neighboring trees problem. There is one last problem we need to solve. When there is a solid block above a Nylium block, there is a chance it's random ticked and turns into netherrack. It does not happen very often. I've sped up here the process to illustrate it, but it can happen, and it would break the farm. Well, in fact, it only happens if there is a player in a 128 blocks radius around the Nylium block. Of course, a simple solution to get rid of this problem would just be to build a farm far away from the players and load the chunks with portal-based things, contraptions, or things like that. But this is not very useful because you never know if another player will not eventually come to visit your farm and eventually break it. So here I've preferred another solution. A netherrack block can be turned back into Nylium by using bone meal on it if there is another Nylium block next to it or in diagonal. In our case, we will use this property by using a part of the excess of bone meal produced by the farm on all the Nylium blocks periodically. Like so, if one of them has turned into a netherrack, it will be converted back into the Nylium block. If not, it will just add a little periodical boost on the fungus production, which is also good. However, during the time a block is netherrack, it can't be used to grow trees, which means that the ratio of the farm will decrease until it's fixed. But as this is a very rare event, it does not hurt the bone meal return rate too much, and in fact it allows the farm to properly run indefinitely, even with a player nearby, which is very nice. Now that we have seen all the technical parts of the farm, we can watch it working. So basically all the farm is controlled by this very fast clock here. It triggers the center dispenser here to grow fungus and the top dispensers here trying to grow the trees. After 3 trials to grow the trees, the Nylium blocks are pulled down by these pistons here and the cycle starts again. After this cycle is performed a certain amount of time, the clock is disconnected from the dispensers and the TNT begins. Once the TNT cycle is over, is finished, a signal is sent from the top down to this daylight sensor here, and the clock is reconnected to the dispensers, restarting the whole thing from the beginning. All the blocks that are blown up and the one from the Nylium blocks end up in this water stream here, where they are sorted here. If there are items we want to keep, they are simply stored inside this chest, and otherwise they are composted here below. The bone meal is sent to the system through this water stream here, back into this chest that splits the bone meal into the two upper lines that supply the dispensers on both sides. The magenta line here activates the pistons that will grasp and push up the logs on top of the Nylium blocks to the collection area. It's activated twice, a first time before the TNT explodes. This could fail to push the block if there are already too many blocks above for a piston to push. In this case, the block will be evacuated just after the TNT sequence. The brown line here is the line that will periodically activate all the bottom dispensers, trying to transform Netherrack back into Nylium blocks. It is timed to triggers at the exact same time than the center dispensers, so all the 5 bottom dispensers fire simultaneously for a boost in the vegetation growth. So how many times do we need to run the vegetation growth breaking cycle before starting the TNT cycle? Well, this is basically a parameter we can tweak to control the log per hour rate of the farm. The more cycles we perform between each TNT, the more trees we grow and the less time we spend with TNT blowing up nothing, increasing the log per hour rate. On the other hand, this also means less bone meals as trees would grow more often next to each other, and more netherrack blocks because the logs would remain longer on top of the Nylium blocks before being evacuated by the pistons. Of course, this second issue would only be a real problem if there is always a player near the farm. If most of the time there is not, Nylium can't turn into netherrack at all, and it does not impact significantly the bone meal creation of the farm. On the back of the farm here, we have this contraption, which counts the number of times the Nylium blocks are pulled down. Once all the items have been transferred from one dropper to the other, the TNT cycle starts. So by changing the amount of items in this dropper, we can directly influence the log and bone meal produced per hour for the farm. Here I have added the rates you can expect from this farm depending on this parameter. These rates are average over more than 15 hours testing this farm for each configuration. So basically, if you want to build this farm in your pace, where there will be a player nearby very often, you should go for only 2 cycles. This way, the farm would produce 900 logs and an excess of around 30 bone meals per hour. On the opposite, if you know this farm will most of the time be further away than 128 blocks from any player, you should go with a 3 cycle version. It would produce more than 1060 logs and also 30 bone meals per hour. And finally, if you have access to another bone meal source that you can connect to this farm, like the poppies of an iron farm for example, you can try to increase the number of cycles to 4 or 5 to produce even more items per hour. After some testing, I found out that increasing the cycles above 5 actually hurts the performances and decreases the rates. Here, on this side, we have a very similar counter that is used for the Netherrack regeneration bone meal. The basic setting I use for the farm is every 32 bone meal cycle. This is consistent with the farm production rate and a good trade-off between Netherrack remaining too long and bone meal being consumed too fast. As we want the dispensers to all fire up at the same time, we actually need the number of items in these droppers to be a multiple of the one in the other counter. So for example, if we run the 2 cycles version, we need 32 items here, 33 items for 3 cycles, 32 for 4, and 30 or 35 for the 5 cycle version. We also always need a 1 item shift between the 2 counters, so that's why we have 31 items in this dropper and 1 in this one instead of 32 in one dropper. Now, if you have access to a very efficient bone meal farm, like a moss farm in 1.17 plus versions, you can also overclock this farm to produce more logs per hour. It's very simple. Here, we do not target bone meal efficiency anymore, but instead only fast tree growth. So the idea is that every single time, we fire the 5 bottom dispensers to get as many fungus as possible. This leads to much higher bone meal consumption, but also much higher logs per hour rates, up to 1650 logs per hour, at the cost of nearly 1000 bone meal per hour. In this case, having a player nearby is not an issue anymore, as all the Nylium blocks are bone milled each time. In all this video, I've only used the warp variant of the Nylium and Fungus, because it's more efficient for bone meal collection. However, if you want to convert this farm to the crimson variant, it's totally possible and very easy. You just need to replace the two side Nylium blocks here and on the other side. And below here, to replace the center blocks, you actually need to remove these torches. Then you can access the Nylium blocks here. You can replace the 5 Nylium blocks on all the pistons. And now you can replace the torches and everything is done. You don't have to worry about the minecarts, they will remain in position during the process, so it's actually a very easy operation you can do in a few seconds. You also would need to change some filters in the item sorting system, but it's also quite easy to do. I think I've covered everything. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to this channel if you don't want to miss next videos. If you have any question about this farm or huge fungus farming, please ask in the comments. I will read them all and try to answer them as best as I can. Also, as this is my first video, any feedback for improvements are more than welcome. Once again, you'll find the building tutorial link and the world download in the description. Now, happy huge fungus farming and see you in the next video.